Hey friends, happy Wednesday. I know it's not Tuesday, but that's okay. If you're new around here, first off, let me say welcome, but now let me tell you why I just apologized. Every week, I try to upload a pre-recorded and edited video on Tuesdays telling a quilty story of sorts. That story can be a range of different things. It could be talking about a package I got in the mail. It could be telling the story of a quilt I've recently finished or a project I want to or am going to start. It could even be talking about a trip that I've taken, or maybe it's just going to talk about a tip, trick, or notion that I've discovered in my quilting journey. Lots of fun content, and the whole idea here is to inspire you to make something and to get to know me a little bit better. I hope you look forward to these weekly uploads as much as I look forward to creating them for you. And the best way you can say thank you is, of course, watch the video from start to end. But don't forget to give me a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit that little subscribe down below. So today's video content is going to be jam-packed. I made a nice video outline to make sure I covered all of the topics for you. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff, including the quilt that is hanging up behind me. We're also going to talk about what my mom accomplished while she was here for almost 6 weeks. We're going to talk about a collab that I have coming up with Sean over at The Guy Who Sews. And I'm going to give you some of the tips that I apply to my life to help keep me organized, on task, and producing more quilts. So let's talk about my mom before we dive into anything else, because this is the one that I am super proud of. My mom was here for 6 weeks, and she is a brand new quilter. She's just getting started and honing her skill. And I can't believe the amount of work that she put in over the 6 weeks that she was here and what she actually accomplished. I'm kind of proud of her, to be honest. It all started with our quilting retreat back in July. When we went down there, she completed 2 quilt tops, and she wasn't planning to come back here until probably Christmas time, but I think the fabric called her. I'd like to say that she came here to spend time with me, but I think she came here to take my fabric from me. It was only a couple of weeks before she made her way back up to Northern Virginia, and she stayed put for about 6 weeks. During that time, it was important that I gave her some projects to work on. Mom likes to have a lot of variety, but does get overwhelmed pretty easily. I can definitely relate to that. She wants to have multiple pokers in the fire, but she doesn't want so many pokers in the fire that she's just losing track of what's happening and feels overwhelmed. And so what we figured out for her is her sweet spot is 3 active projects. But it can't just be any project, because not all projects are created equal. We learned that it's better for her to have 2 easier projects that she can work on independently and switch out as she wants to, and then 1 project that is a little bit more challenging, helping her to learn a new skill that she hasn't quite mastered yet. So what were those 3 projects that she worked on? Well, one of them was her layer cake pop quilt. This is a quilt that I finished at retreat back in July, and she was supposed to work on alongside of me, but like the good daughter that I am, I totally left that at home, and we didn't even realize that it was missing until we got to retreat 12 hours away from my house and unpacked everything. So that was fun. This is what I would consider her challenging project, because she's working on putting star blocks together, which is a completely new skill for her. There's something about sewing on that 45-degree line instead of just running parallel to the raw edge of your fabric that's giving her a little bit of trouble. She's doing it, but she needs to take that a little bit slower. So what are those other 2 projects that Mom worked on? Well, they were what we called her easy sews. These were projects that she felt confident enough to do with little to no help. And they were designed to be on her plate to give her a little bit of variety so she could work on project A or project B, depending on what mood she was in. And she didn't need me standing over her shoulder teaching her how to do anything. It was stuff she could do while I was at work and feel like she was still making progress. I think, in hindsight, that was one of the lessons that I learned from our time together over the spring when I was trying to teach her how to sew. Everything that she did in the spring had to be done with me in the room. And so there was no time for her to really take that homework and just practice without me hovering over her shoulder. That's not necessarily bad, but I work during the day. And so when I'm not home, it meant that she couldn't really sew. This time around, we changed that up a little bit. I feel like she started and finished piecing 2 Jelly Roll Race quilts while she was here, but for the life of me, right now it escapes my mind what the other one would have been. One of them I do know is the Jelly Roll Race quilt that she made for me out of the Tulip Pink True Colors Jelly Roll. And I got to tell you, she did not love that fabric, and she made it known when she was putting the quilt together. But once she had the inner border attached and then the outer border, and she stopped, stepped away, and looked at it, she fell in love. So she learned a very important lesson with that project, that sometimes the fabric doesn't look so great when you're working with it, but when you finish the quilt, it looks amazing. The second project that she worked on is what I call her charm square quilt. I had a charm pack of Seashore Drive by Sherry and Chelsea. Now, there's a whole story behind this charm pack because the fabric line is honestly one of my favorites, and I have worked with it a lot this year. I did the Magnolia quilt with Tiffany out of that fabric. I did my Jolly Bar 4 quilt out of that fabric. And I feel like I kept sewing with it. And every time I made a quilt or a project out of that fabric line, the quilt disappeared out of my studio. Somebody wanted the quilt, or I paid it forward to someone else. And so while we were in Alabama, I picked up a charm pack of that Seashore Drive because I knew I had no more of it. And I wanted to do something with that fabric. Well, Mom liked it too. And she begged, or maybe stole, insert your own opinion, that charm pack from me. And I couldn't say no. So she took that charm pack and wanted to make a quilt with it, but she didn't know what to do. So I just gave her a really simple project. We took all 42 pieces of fabric that were in the charm pack, and then we cut a bunch, and I don't know how many, but a bunch of 2.5-inch strips by width of fabric. And all we did was worked on adding a 2.5-inch strip of fabric to all 4 sides of all of those squares. Once that was done, we had 42 slightly bigger squares that we just sewed together in 7 rows of 6 across, and then just put a border on it and called it done. Now, this is a smaller quilt. It's not nearly as big as the one hanging up behind me, but it is great for a lap quilt to toss on your couch. My mom is going to make a quilt for all 4 of her kids and then all of her grandkids. And this quilt, the charm quilt, is going to go to my sister Alicia. And I'm really excited for her to get it. She's already seen it. She knows what it looks like, and she cannot wait to get it. And she had a great idea that we're going to do to all of these quilts. Several years ago, my dad passed away, and a few years ago, Alicia found a birthday card that he had signed "Love Dad" to, and she decided she was going to take that card, scan it into her computer, and then turn it into a vinyl cutout that she then put on a framed piece of canvas and gave to all of her siblings. So now all 4 of us have this little framed piece of art that just simply says "Love Dad" in my dad's handwriting. And for me, that is something that I cherish and I keep proudly on display in my sewing room. She thought it would be a great idea to incorporate something like that into the quilts that Mom was making. So what I plan to do is get a piece of fabric and a Micron 05 pen and use some freezer paper to stabilize the fabric and have Mom handwrite a special message for each child on their quilt, and we'll affix that as the label to the back of her quilt. If we want to take it a step further, we could even do some hand embroidery over top of her handwriting so that way it doesn't fade over time. But I think the Micron pens are supposed to be permanent. So for right now, we're just planning to handwrite, and maybe later we can go back and hand embroider. Mom actually did have one more finish that she sort of contributed to, but didn't do herself. One of the Jelly Roll Race quilts that she did was one that she made at Huntsville. This is the first quilt top that she's ever made. It's wonky, it didn't lay completely flat, and it's definitely not square, but it is a quilt that she made, and that one is going to go to my other sister, Nicole. Nicole already knows it's coming her way, and she's super excited about it. Originally, Mom wanted to take that quilt and do all of the quilting on it herself. So we got it loaded on the long arm, and I showed her how to do some basic loop-de-loops on it, and she just wasn't feeling it. I don't think right now long arm quilting is something that's really in the cards for her, and that is okay. She is completely content making the quilt tops, and we will let her live in that lane because I can quilt them for her, or we can always send them out. But in this case, I didn't touch it and I didn't send it out either, but it's done. And that's because Mary jumped in. Mary has been dying to learn how to do more free motion quilting. She's bought books, she wants to practice, and she keeps talking about how she wants to do things on the long arm, but she doesn't have the quilt tops to do that. And I don't think she wants to practice on some of the quilts that she has put a lot of hard work into. But that Jelly Roll Race was an imperfect quilt that just needed to get done, and Mary was confident that she was going to be able to do enough of a good job that the quilt would be fine. So she gave herself the freedom to just try. She called it Mary Doodles, Mary Doodling all over the quilt. She just did loops all over, just getting herself used to the sound and the feel of the long arm machine. She didn't worry about whether it looked perfect. She didn't worry about if she crossed over areas where she shouldn't have. She didn't worry about if she had to draw straight lines instead of doing nice big open loops. She just quilted it. And I think she probably quilted it to death, but she had a lot of fun doing it. That quilt is now completely finished, minus the label. She did all the quilting on it, and over the course of this week, I took that quilt off the long arm, squared it up, and put the binding on it, and even gave it its first wash. My sister Nicole should be visiting for Halloween at the end of October, and I have that quilt already set aside, ready to gift to her, but I don't think we're going to let her take it home until we can do the label on the back. Oh yeah, and for those of you wondering who won the Jelly Roll Race, me or Mom, it was definitely Mom. Neither of our quilts are finished. However, they are both pieced, and hers had all of the strips put together and both of the borders affixed long before mine did. Mine is done though, and I'm quite pleased with how it's turned out. I don't know if I like mine better or Mom's better, but they're both pieced and ready for the long arm. I think we're going to leave those set aside so that Mary can do some special doodling on them when she comes back from visiting her own mom at the end of October. So if you're keeping track, Mom won, back 0. Before I talk about what I accomplished this week, I want to talk about a collab I'm doing with Sean from The Guy Who Sews. I'll link to his channel down below, but I'm really excited and also intimidated by this project. Sean is known for working on some very beautiful quilts. Specifically, I have admired the quilts that he's done following the Elizabeth Hartman patterns and the Wizard of Oz quilt, which I think he did following Art Meets East. Those are patterns that I love to look at, but get intimidated by the amount of cutting that is required to do the quilt. Seriously, if I could find somebody to cut those quilt kits, label them nicely, and send them my way, I would definitely jump in. But the cutting is a whole lot of work. Sean knows that I've been talking about these patterns for a while, and he's been gently nudging me to try them. And being the wonderful enabler that he is, he threw the gauntlet and called me this spring and said, I've got an idea. He proposed that we both tackle an Elizabeth Hartman pattern together at the same time so that we could encourage and inspire each other to keep going. And what I think he really meant by that is, hey, I'll do it if you do it, and because I'm doing it, maybe you won't quit. Challenge accepted, Sean. Challenge accepted. I knew when we picked the pattern, Pandas in Sweaters by Elizabeth Hartman, that I was going to make this quilt for Mary. She loves pandas. Seriously, I think the woman would wear a panda costume every day of the week if she could. Her bedroom is decked out in pandas. Her jacket is covered in pandas. Her license plate on her car references pandas. The woman loves a panda. So, of course, I knew that the quilt was going to eventually end up with Mary, so I didn't hide that from her when I told her that I was going to make it. I told her I would make this quilt for her, and I just wanted her to pick out the fabric that would be used as the panda sweaters and help me colorize it the way that she wanted it to be. Mary was super excited that I was making this quilt for her, and she offered me deal of a lifetime. She said, "Hey, what if I cut the quilt for you?" And I thought, huh, why not? What a generous offer. Yes, Mary, please take all the fabric off of my shelves that you would need and cut the panda quilt for me, and I will piece it and get it quilted and bound and labeled and gift it to you. Thank you. Hindsight, I don't know if that was a great idea because I think I caused myself more work. Mary has a queen size bed in her bedroom that she loves to have covered with a panda comforter or a panda quilt, and so she was really excited about this. Unbeknownst to me, she decided that that quilt was not big enough, according to the pattern instructions, for her queen size bed. Normally, when she buys a comforter or makes a quilt for her bed, she goes with the king size option because it gives her the drape over her queen size bed that she's looking for. And it does look nice, I will admit that. But unfortunately, the pattern, which had just 9 panda blocks surrounded by a small border of the background fabric, wasn't gonna cut it. So she upsized to not 12, but 20 panda blocks. That's right. I'm going to do 20 huge panda blocks for this quilt, almost 3 times the amount of blocks that the original pattern called for. It'll give her that ginormous quilt that she's looking for her bed, but it's going to take me a long time to piece. So, Mary 1, back 0. So how am I going to tackle this? Well, obviously, Sean's quilt is going to be finished long before mine is. In fact, I'm willing to bet that Sean's quilt will be pieced, quilted, bound, labeled, and make a trip over to visit the giant pandas in the Great Republic of China before my blocks are even put together. But slow and steady wins the race. So my goal, and this is a lofty goal, is to try to do one panda block a week for the next 20 weeks. When I look ahead over the next 6 months, my goodness, I know there's going to be times where I just cannot do a panda block that week. So I feel like it's probably going to take me closer to 9 months to put this together. And the reason why I'm sharing all that with you is because you have plenty of time to get in on this. Slow and steady wins the race. If it's going to take me around 9 months to piece, if you do the quilt in the size that the pattern calls for, that's only 1 panda block a month for you versus my 4 or 5 a month for me. If you want to do this with Sean and I, you'll want to check out his progress on his channel, watch his videos. He's going to talk about his progress in his panda quilt, I believe in his podcasts that go up on Sunday. And then if you want to pick up the pattern, I'll link to that pattern over at Fat Quarter Shop in the show notes down below. So what did I work on this week? Well, a couple of projects, but before we talk about them, let me first remind you of what my goal was for 2023. I started the year with a number of block of the month programs that had already concluded previously, and I wanted several of those to be done before December 31st, 2023. And by done, I am completely okay with it just being pieced and not yet quilted. A few weeks ago, I shared with you that my oldest UFO was actually a block of the month. It was the Fat Quarter Shop Designer Mystery Quilt from 2018. that quilt has been pieced and I sent it off to Beth for some lovely quilting. And I can't wait to get that back here, get it bound and cuddle with it. It's going to be great. But as soon as that quilt was done, I was ready to move into my next block of the month. And I decided I was going to work on the Rose and Bloom quilt, which is the one hanging up behind me. The reason why I chose this one over some of the others is because this one was the closest to being finished of all of my block of the months. This was a project that I signed up for and treated as a personal sew. It was a pattern written by Lella Boutique, which I just absolutely loved, and it featured the Love Note fabric, also by Lella Boutique, which I also just absolutely loved. What drew me to this block of the month was the idea of having a good sized finished quilt with that Love Note fabric. Typically, when a fabric line comes out that I just absolutely love, I'll buy a fat quarter bundle of it, and then I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. So it sits on my shelves for a while, maybe even forever. Seriously, I don't know what to do with the fat quarter bundles. The idea here was that I had a quilt finished featuring a fabric line that I just absolutely loved looking at. So instead of buying the fat quarter bundle of Love Note, I invested in the quilt kit. Once the quilt was all pieced together, according to the pattern instructions, it just didn't feel finished to me. The pattern did not call for the two borders that you see on the quilt behind me, and it was still a really good size, but I wanted to make it bigger. And so what I chose to do is add a couple of borders. I knew right away, once the quilt was done, I wanted that thin inner border of that teal with the hearts on it. But I did not have any of that fabric. So I had to go search online, find a place that had the fabric, get it ordered, wait for it to arrive, and then attach the inner border. My plan was to repurpose the backing fabric that they gave to us as the final outer bigger border to really give this quilt a good amount of size. But once I had that inner border on there and I held up the white main floral fabric, yeah, it didn't look right. That print was great, but it was the white colorway of the floral, and it really took your eyes away from the quilt, and I didn't feel like it was a good frame. So I had to think about what I wanted to do next. And it was actually Mary's idea to get the floral fabric in that same teal color as the inner border and put them onto the quilt. Ultimately, I think that was a great choice because if you look closely at the quilt, you'll see that there are areas where you have the teal heart fabric and it's usually touching the teal cottage roses, I think is what they're called, the teal floral fabric. And so it just kind of continued that design element into the borders. The quilt is huge. When I measured it, it came out at around 96 inches square. I think this is going to be something that I'll be able to put on my king size bed. And that's a good thing too, because my husband actually likes it as well. But I don't think that I'm going to tackle the quilting on this because it is so big. Tucker from Tucker Sewing and Quilting has already seen this, and I told him I just wanted to get an edge to edge on it and get it done. And his words were, "You're going to do an edge to edge on that?" He firmly believes that this needs to have at least semi-custom quilting on it. And I thought, well, if you want to tackle it, my friend, I will send it to you instead of sending it to Beth. And so he's up for the challenge. So I think what's going to happen with this quilt is I'm going to mail it off to Tucker and we're going to see what sort of magic he can do on it. You'll want to make sure to stay tuned to the channel because once I get the quilt back from Tucker, I'll share it with you. The second block of the month is actually one that I hosted for the members of my VIP program over on my website. In January of this year, I told them I wanted to do the Among the Stars Again block of the month. I gave them a link to the pattern over at Fat Quarter Shop and told them that I was going to take it slow and steady in 2023. I even gave us a nice detailed schedule that took us all the way through September to get the quilt top assembled. This is another pattern, ironically, also written by Lella Boutique and also put together with Lella Boutique fabric. Noticing a bit of a trend this week. This is using the Christmas morning fabric, which is the fabric she used in the pattern, and I figured I had a fat quarter bundle of it, so why not just make the quilt exactly like she had the quilt in the book? The problem was life happened. So here I am hosting a block of the month with my VIP members, and in month 1 I was on track. Month 2 I was on track. Month 3 I got that one done a week late, and then I just stopped. It's an 8-month series. In months 1 through 6, you make 2 big blocks. In month 7, you make 6 finish setting blocks. And then in month 8, you put the whole thing together. It's not a terribly hard sew, but I found it was something I just wasn't prioritizing working on. And so it sat and continued to get behind and behind and behind. But there's no way I want to finish 2023 with this quilt not put together. In fact, I want this quilt quilted and bound because it's a Christmas themed quilt, and I have visions of cuddling under it in front of the fire and the Christmas tree this year. So I am pleased to tell you that as of the recording of this video, I have all of the blocks pieced, and they're even sewn together into the quilt center. The only thing left to do is the borders. The pattern calls for this really kind of cool, jagged looking pieced border, which I feel looks a little bit like snowflakes, but I'm not entirely sure that I'm up for the task. I'm wondering if instead of doing that pieced border, I could just find a decent amount of a focal print from the Christmas morning line and just put that on as a big print border and call it done. But somehow that feels a little bit like cheating, because one of the things that really drew my eye to this pattern was that pieced border, but it's going to be a decent amount of work. So I'm kind of torn. I don't know if I should go for the pieced border or if I should just scrap it and do a big print. I guess we'll have to wait and find out. So that's what I worked on over the past week, and I feel like I've had a good, productive couple of weeks. Frequently, I get questions asking about how I stay productive while juggling home, work, a daughter, a YouTube channel, all of those things. So I want to close today's video and talk about the things that I do to help me stay productive. In a nutshell, I try to have a plan and stick to it. And there are 3 components to that. So the first thing that I do is I make time to sew. This is something that is very important to me, and I've got to be able to work it out around my family. Fortunately, I only have one child in the home, and she is a teenager, and I'm not cool enough to hang out with her most of the time. So it's a little bit easier for me to find those pockets of time when my husband is busy or otherwise preoccupied, and my daughter is too busy to be bothered by her super uncool mom. Those are the times when I look forward to retreating to my sewing room and working on my own projects. For example, on Monday nights, my husband goes to a fencing club, and I know that he's not going to be here for a couple of hours. I know my daughter's going to be upstairs playing video games once her homework is done, and so that's my me time. I prioritize Monday nights to be in my sewing room working on projects that I want to work on. The takeaway here is there are pockets of time throughout the week where I'm not needed by my family, by my job, or by anybody else. And I make sure that my work-life commitments are okay with me stepping away to be in my studio. Sometimes that might be just a small 30-minute session, and other days it might be an entire day of nonstop glorious quilting. One thing about that, though, is I know that sewing is a form of therapy for myself, and I really want to make sure that I'm in here at least once every 2 or 3 days. Number 2 is knowing what you have to do. Once you have some time carved out to sew, whether it's at your dining room table or in your sewing room, it's so helpful to know what you have to work on and where you left it off. Could you imagine having just a 30-minute session to be able to sit down at your sewing machine and be productive, and then walking in and not knowing what projects that you had to work on and where you left them off? You could waste valuable minutes trying to figure out where you were, and that cuts into your productivity. So I find that by making lists, It keeps me on track. What I do is I create one list for every quilt I'm working on. I name the list, the name of the quilt project, and then within it, I have an item on the list for every task that has to be created or done for that quilt to be finished. So, for example, when I was talking about Rose and Bloom, I would have done month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, and then when all the months were done, I would have had a task for assembling the quilt, and then another one for quilting it, and another one for binding it. That helps me stay on track. And of course, you can get much more detailed with those checklist items if you want to, but this is the perfect balance between not micromanaging the entire project, but still keeping me on track. It's what works for me, but you can go as deep as you want to. You don't have to use a computer software, by the way, to make these lists. You could do it in a notebook or just a single sheet of paper that you keep with your project supplies so that you know where you left off. If you do want to use software, though, there are two pieces of software that I recommend: Trello and Jira. Jira is from a company called Atlassian. Both of them offer project management type software on a website for free that you can access from a computer, a smartphone, or a tablet. They are both relatively easy to use, and the whole idea is that you take a big project and you decompose it into smaller pieces of work, and you focus on getting those smaller pieces of work done so that the big quilt can be done. You know, they say the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, and that's true with the quilt. The best way to get the quilt done is one block at a time, and I feel like task lists allow me to focus on that. Personally, I use Jira from Atlassian to manage all of my stuff, and I get really geeky about this, so I don't want to lose you too much on it, but I will tell you one of the neat things about using computer-based lists like this is the ability to manage my schedule. I could, for example, take all of the tasks for a specific quilt and schedule them out for all the days that I know I'm going to be able to sew. But like I said, you don't have to use the computer software. You can totally do this with pen and paper. I would just make sure that you keep those lists in a notebook that you have ready and available, or keep a checklist sheet with your project supplies, which takes me to item number 3, and that is making sure that you have your supplies. You have to have your materials ready to go so that you can make the most use of the time that you have in your sewing room. Could you imagine? It's a busy weeknight. You have 30 minutes. That's it. And you walk into your room. You know exactly the project you need to work on, exactly where you left off, but you can't find the pattern. Or maybe you can't find your starch. Or maybe you can't find your background fabric. I don't know. Some critical element for that project is missing. And now you have to spend those precious moments searching for the item that you need to make progress. This is something that I struggled with too, until I started organizing my projects by project in project containers. I use Sterilite containers that are made to hold 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and I find that most of the time, one of these containers is enough room to store an entire quilt project. Sometimes, if the quilt's particularly big, I may need to break that quilt project out into bin 1 and bin 2, but most of the time I can fit it in just the one. What I like about these quilt containers is the lids lock, so it makes the bins portable. I can travel with them without losing anything. And then the other thing is that they're stackable, so I can keep them stored nicely on the IKEA Billy bookshelves that are behind me. Now, every project I'm going to do doesn't go into a bin, because then all of my fabric would be in bins just about. Instead, what I do is, once I have curated the fabric and the pattern, and I know that this is something I want to start doing, then I put it in a bin. If I only have the fabric together or I only have the pattern, it doesn't get a bin until I have both elements and I have a plan to get started. I keep everything in this bin: the pattern, the fabric, and anything else that I might need for myself, so that when I walk into my space and I know, okay, it's time to work on Rose and bloom, I can pull that out, take the lid off, and everything is right there. As I finish the blocks, guess where they go? Back in that bin. To make things even a little simpler, I even have a label maker and I print off a label with the name of the quilt and attach it to the side of the project bin so that I don't have to rummage through any of the bins or think about what's in there. All I got to do is read the label and I know that's what I need to pull and work on. The whole goal of these 3 steps is to make sure that I am taking any thought out of just getting into the room and sewing. I want to save the thinking power for putting my quilts together and making progress rather than trying to figure out what I'm doing. Those are the tips that I use to help keep me productive. I feel like they keep me efficient and on task, and hopefully they'll help me realize my goal of finishing all of my block of the months before the end of 2023. Speaking of block of the months, by the way, I do want to let you know I am actively sewing the 2023 designer mystery quilt from Fat Quarter Shop, and I am doing those blocks on my Friday night live streams. In fact, this Friday, September 15th, 2023, I will be putting together block number 3 from the 2023 designer mystery quilt. We got that block in August and I'm a little behind, so I need to get caught up. But next week on September 22nd, I'll be putting together block number 4, which I just got in the mail yesterday. So hopefully I'll be caught up on that one by the time the month ends. Obviously, I'm not going to have the 2023 designer mystery quilt finished at the end of 2023 because it runs into 2024. But gosh, it would be wonderful if I could end this year with all of my other ones finished and that one caught up. Thank you, friends, so much for checking in to see what's been going on in my sewing room. Don't forget to tune in Friday night where we sew the block of the month block together. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!